The National Veterans Memorial and Museum began with a vision from the late Senator John Glenn, who understood the value of telling and sharing the story of our veterans. From the initial view, the architecture impresses upon visitors the importance of what lies within. Seeming to rise organically from the earth, the building itself is a symbol of our nation's veterans and their resilient spirit and unending commitment to making this country stronger. Once inside the museum, visitors embark on a narrative journey, following exhibitions that focus on the servicemen and women and their families. Individual stories and shared experiences are illustrated through personal artifacts, quotes, letters, photographs, and powerful films of veterans telling their unique story in their own words. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It's more than a museum. It's the new home of the brave. Plan your visit today.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest installment of Virtual Rally Point. My name is Colonel Retired Bill Butler, Chief of Staff at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum, and on behalf of our President and CEO, Lieutenant General Mike Ferder, would just like to welcome everybody and thank you all for joining. You know, in our previous rally points, we've talked to servicemen and women who received some really grievous wounds and endured multiple surgeries on the road to recovery. And their stories are incredible and inspirational. We haven't yet spoken with the teams of medical professionals who care for and in many cases put our physically broken servicemen and women back together. So joining us today are two medical professionals who treated our wounded and saw recovery from a very unique perspective. Dr. Greg Argyros served for 25 years in the Army Medical Corps, most recently as the Chief of Medicine at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And Dr. Rocco Armonda served on active duty for 27 years and commanded a far forward neurosurgery team in Iraq. Both graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and they will share their stories today. So the wars of today are significantly different than those in all previous wars and eras. In the 18th and 19th centuries, disease, infection, and non-battle injuries killed many more combatants than did the actual combat. In the wars of the 20th century, penicillin was a game changer. It allowed doctors and nurses to prevent and defeat infection. Survival rates for combat wounded increased significantly, as did the non-battle injuries and recovery from those. The limiting factor up until Vietnam was the slow nature of casualty evacuation, which was limited to trucks and field ambulances. With the advent of helicopters, those wounded in action could be evacuated more quickly, but air crews still had to contend with surface-to-air missiles, rockets, and effective air defense from the enemy. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. and NATO allies enjoyed total air supremacy. As a result, most casualties who could be stabilized by combat medics or combat lifesavers survived to receive higher levels of care. This is especially true if casualties were evacuated within the golden hour. Facilitating today's conversation is our President and CEO, combat veteran of Mogadishu, Somalia, and multiple tours in Iraq, and Ranger Hall of Famer, Lieutenant General Mike Ferder. Sir, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and welcome. Greg and Armando, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's just start with some introductions. So, Greg, if you'd go first and just tell us about yourself, how you got in the Army, and your perspective as we get started.
Sure. Thank you, General. My name is Greg Argyros. I am a pulmonary critical care medicine physician, and I am currently the president of MedStar Washington Hospital Center, a 912-bed hospital in Washington, D.C. Before my sophomore year in high school, my family took our annual trip to New Jersey. We would go to the beach. I'm from Pittsburgh originally. And at that time, we went up and visited the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And little did I know was I was taking my first college trip to West Point. And it was at that point that I began to consider that as something that I would look at for college. And you really have to start that early because it's a long process to get into the service academy, and decided that I would go that route. I wanted to be an engineer. At that point, I was part of a class that still had everyone graduate with a degree in engineering. West Point was the last of the military academies to offer majors, and medicine was not something that I had ever considered. My mother was a nurse, my father was a pharmacist, but again, medicine was not anything that ever interested me. So myself and most of my classmates took the same curriculum for the 4 years, other than a handful of classes that we could take in an area of concentration for us. My sophomore year, I had an elective that I had because of some AP credit that I'd gotten in high school, and I don't remember what the name of the course was, but it essentially was human physiology, and I loved it. I thought, this is it for me. And it was at that point I looked into, can you even be a physician out of the service academy? And at that point, 2% of every graduating class could go straight to medical school. And I pursued that route. I went to the University of Pittsburgh for medical school on a health profession scholarship. And after my time there, came to Walter Reed in 1987, and then spent the last 25 years of my career as a pulmonary critical care medicine, and then with progressively increasing leadership responsibilities at that time, up through the closure of the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center and the stand-up of the new Walter Reed National Military Medical Center over on the grounds of Bethesda, Maryland.
Well, thanks for that. And then Rocco, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so my background is very similar. So I got interested in West Point, though, much earlier, about midway through high school, and went through my last 2 years of high school was a military high school, and through junior ROTC was able to secure an appointment to West Point. But then once I was at West Point, I realized, my chances of getting directly into medical school may not be as good because you're surrounded by superstars there. Everybody was a big fish in their high school, and you're surrounded by people who are just absolutely brilliant. So my backup plan was to go combat engineers, and I was branched engineers, but I was lucky enough to finish high enough in class standing and to get into the uniformed services. So from West Point, I went into the uniformed services in 1986 and finished in 1990. And then from there, I did neurosurgery. So it was 7 years of neurosurgery residency at the old Walter Reed. And then from there, I went to Philadelphia for 2 years in fellowship in vascular neurosurgery and interventional neuroradiology. And then I came back to the DC area in 1999 to serve back my commitment. And I had the opportunity in 2003 to lead a team in Iraq. We were the 207th Neuro Team. Our moniker was the Skull Crackers. And we were stationed basically 15 miles west of Baghdad and about 5 miles south of Fallujah with the 28th Combat Support Hospital for a year. And we were out in the open desert for about the first 5-6 months. And then in August, right after the UN was attacked, we actually moved into the Green Zone, into Ebn Sina. And then we were there at Ebn Sina in the Green Zone until about March of 2004. And then we redeployed home. And then once I got back home, I was very active. At that time, it was at the Naval Hospital Bethesda that then merged with Walter Reed and became the new Walter Reed Military Medical Center. I'm very active in terms of maintaining high standards of care for patients coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. You developed a very special bond with the patients and families that you were taking care of overseas. And when you came back, you wanted to make sure that those patients got the very highest of care. And then after I finished my tour of duty in 2013, I joined the team here at MedStar and served primarily at Washington Hospital Center with an academic appointment at Georgetown. So we keep our ties with Walter Reed. We have Walter Reed residents and fellows who rotate with us. We're the busiest stroke center in the hospital, or stroke hospital really, and center in Washington, D.C. We're also the busiest trauma center in Washington, D.C. And so it's great experience for the Walter Reed residents and the Walter Reed fellows who spend time with us. And it's a great way for us to keep our connection with the military as well.
Well, great. Hey, Greg, as you first looked at it, why the military? And then after you served, what would be your commitment? Why did you stay in the military?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I really did not have family history of being in the military. My uncle served in World War II, and I had always been interested in military history, but really had no connection to the military until we took that trip to up to West Point before my sophomore year in high school, and it just as Rocco said, West Point and all the service academies are full of people that are the big fish in the small pond. And at some point you want to, see for yourself, how do you stack up in a situation like that? And I played sports in high school and was used to a disciplined schedule. So it really wasn't a transition for me, too much of a transition for me. I mean, nothing prepares you for, big barracks at West Point, but it was not that much of a transition for me, and I just loved the esprit de corps and the singularity of the mission that we have in the military. As being a service academy grad and a graduate of a civilian medical school, I had a 9-year payback. Rocco's was longer because he went to USU's. But that payback doesn't start until you have finished your training. So I was an internal medicine resident for 3 years and a pulmonary critical care medicine fellow for 3 years. Then I started my payback. So at that point, I had 15 years in, and it just made sense to me that, when you're that close to 20, and I had loved every opportunity that I had up until that point, that there was no reason for me to not continue on to 20. And then once I hit 20, 21, 25, it was clear to me that the transition from the old Walter Reed to the combined institution, the joint institution, was a good time for me to transition out. But up until that point, everything was an outstanding experience, and I enjoyed coming to work every day up until my last day on active duty.
Yeah. So for those who are listening who are currently serving, or those who are listening who have served, they understand that we don't work for the money, and we don't work for the short hours.
No.
Sure. But
no.
Rocco, same sort of question. Just add for those who didn't serve, who are listening, about the brotherhood and comradeship that you found in those first 12 years of military service that caused you to stick around.
Yeah, it's a very different environment. It's an environment where you're focused on continuation of the mission and the care of the personnel to maintain the mission. So you really check your ego at the door, because what you have to do is you have to look at every total piece of the basic elements that make you successful. And one of the greatest lessons of that was, when we were deployed in the desert. For me, I had never been deployed before. And I trained at medical centers like at Walter Reed, and medical centers like Thomas Jefferson, and was at Uniformed Services and West Point, but had never been deployed in the field. So the first thing I did is I asked my, NCOs, my sergeants, what do we need to be successful out here? Because I've never done this before. Tell me what we need, and I'll listen to you. And, you have to accept a certain amount of humility and ignorance that you don't know these things. And you have to seek out the people who know. They explain to you how ISU 90s and mill vans are used to deploy your equipment in the middle of the desert, and that's a totally different world for me, and you have to understand what, generators you need and what kind of wiring you need and what kind of, limitations you're going to have out in a desert environment to set up a hospital, because it's very, very different than what you have back in the States. And then you have to think about the whole element of logistics. And so into this, basically, it's not just what you do as a surgeon in the operating room, it's the whole process of having the right equipment, the right personnel, and the right delivery system to basically provide this kind of care in an austere environment. It's one thing to do this in DC, where you have beautiful operating rooms, beautiful ICUs, and patients, flown into you. It's another thing to do this in the middle of a desert in an austere environment in the midst of a sandstorm, where you have remote access and limited access to any type of element, whether it be oxygen, IV support, any kind of element that you have, you don't have a limitless supply of. So your logistics become really important. And so there's this connection that you have with the folks back home from your logistics base. There's a connection to the team back home who's receiving the patients and transport that you've operated on. You're just one element in a chain of care. That patient was resuscitated in a battlefield situation. There was a combat medic or far forward PA or physician who was able to stop the bleeding, secure the airway, and get the patient to you so you could then do your job. And so we do our part, and then the patient goes on to the next stage. And then it's the CCAT team, the Air Force team that's transporting that patient back to the States, that's, taking care of the patient from all the ABCs and all the neurologic elements of the exam to prevent secondary injury and maximize recovery. And then the folks back at Walter Reed or back in San Antonio, depending upon where the patient went, are doing their part to keep the patient, to the point of maximal recovery. And then that patient goes on to the VA system, and the VA is doing their part to basically maximize recovery. So it's really important to realize that, you're just one part of this whole chain of care for this individual. And it might be a very critical crossroads where you're able to make a difference, but you're not the singular person. You're just one of many. And it's important that you record your lessons learned, you pass it on to the next team, and that you look at areas where in each individual patient where you could do better and where, improvements can be made. So I think the idea is that if I was to say, compare to civilian sector, a lot of surgeons try to make themselves sort of irreplaceable for business purposes, whereas in the military, it's just the opposite. You make yourself, you train your team members so that you can be as replaceable as possible so that the mission continues if something happens to you. So it's about, they say Charlie Mike about continued mission. It's that same application in the medical world when it comes to the military medical world. You don't want the care to stop because you're incapacitated or you're not available.
Yeah. Did you, for Rocco, did you see different types of trauma and injury other than, something to do with a brain injury where, you were involved in orthopedics or everything else, a gunshot wound and all that? Or
sure. Yeah.
Hands off.
We were absolutely mainly focused for neurosurgery, but in a mass casualty situation, you're another set of hands for the general surgeons.
Yeah.
With the skill sets that I had, I could, help them put in central lines. I could help an orthopedic surgeon put on an external fixator. I could help, one of the ER doctors in terms of, resuscitation. So you made yourself as useful as possible in any kind of a mass casualty situation. You help triage patients.
Yeah. As this transition, then, Greg, it comes over the ocean to you. Then what happens?
Well, it's a different situation, certainly, than what Rocco faced when he was downrange. The patients are stabilized at this point. You largely know what the extent of injury is. And it's, as Rocco mentioned, preparing them for what the next step is going to be for them. As a critical care medicine physician, my primary interaction with returning casualties was working with the neuro and ortho trauma patients that came back. The surgical trauma, abdominal trauma, that kind of thing, was cared for primarily on the surgical intensive care unit side, but we worked very closely with Rocco and his team whenever they were back in Garrison, as well as the orthopedic surgeons. And for those that needed a period of critical care, they spent their time with us. Usually it was a result of either needing support from a respirator that required them to be in the ICU, and sometimes they would have problems with infection because again they very quickly moved from the battlefield all the way back to Walter Reed, and there would be times where there would be infection that would need to be managed. But a key point that Rocco brought up that really differentiates military medicine from civilian medicine is this idea that we are all one team. We have that one mission, and that is to support the fighting force and all of those that support them. And, one of the concepts that I've brought to the hospital center, I've been president for a little over 3 years, and I was the chief medical officer for 5 years before that, responsible for the medical care, quality and safety here, et cetera, is this concept of one team and this idea that we are all in this together, and the input of everyone is absolutely critical to our ability to provide the best possible outcome for our patients. Colonel Butler talked at the beginning in his introduction about some of the advances that military medicine has made to medicine, really since the Civil War. And one that was of critical importance in the ICU involved our behavioral health specialists. We all know that post-traumatic stress disorder has been a significant issue in Vietnam veterans. And we have learned a lot from that time period. And our behavioral health service was involved with every single returning casualty that came back. And this is including those in the ICU. They started seeing them within 24 hours of coming in. We've learned that early intervention can prevent PTSD. And it can be something as simple as, you may not want to talk about something now. You may have people be prepared for what they're going to be dealing with. And, that was just one additional example of how the military has addressed something that was a major challenge from our Vietnam veterans and bringing it to modern healthcare now. In fact, my chief of psychiatry here at the hospital center is my former chief of psychiatry at Walter Reed. And her training is in combat psychiatry, believe it or not. And that was, we would bring this entire team of people, not just the usual people that care for patients in the ICU or in the hospital, but everybody who could potentially benefit the patient today and a month from now, 6 months from now, et cetera. And, the advances we had in prosthetics were truly unbelievable. The IED was a signature injury from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, and we're not sending people to war in suits of armor. And what's at risk? Their head, and that's where Rocco comes in, and their extremities. And the prosthetic work that our team did, beyond cutting edge. And I am sure, when the Paralympics start in a few days, many of the prosthetics that are used by those world-class athletes are prosthetics that were, that were developed from the time in the military. So it really was one team coming together, surrounding every returning casualty with a cocoon of support. Excellent. And that support included support for the families.
I think that's, I really appreciate you bringing that up. So everybody, we're here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, and we're in Columbus, Ohio, coming to you wherever you are with two distinguished doctors from the U.S. Army. And just mentioned by Dr. Greg here that the mental health side of treatment begins as soon as all other treatments occur. And here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, we currently have two exhibits that are visiting and traveling exhibits. One is depicting the invisible, those invisible wounds of PTSD. And that's in our downstairs rotunda, sort of. And then upstairs, we have Honor 365, which is the replica of the Twin Towers, and with all the names of those who fell on 9/11. And Honor 365 is an organization that works to prevent suicide. And so one of the reasons that the National Veterans Memorial Museum is such a terrific place is because we look to impact lives and to bring great shows such as this to you so you can hear how people think and how they've acted and been and the experiences they've had with regard to these matters. And so we're going to continue to work to connect veterans to each other, connect them to healthy habits, healthy activities, and to ensure that their life can go on and the wounds that need to heal can be healed. I was wondering, with regard to connection, to what degree have our soldiers or our wounded service members years afterwards reached back to try to make closure with you as the surgeons? And Rocco, I'll start with you. Have they sought you out? Have you been able to talk to those who you saved?
Yeah, I've been very lucky. It's a small world in terms of, people who were deployed and people who had the severest of traumatic brain injuries, because they were all centralized for the most part, I would say 80, 90% at Walter Reed. So since I was there on a daily basis, then, I had a chance to interact with the families, interact with the patients, and have stayed in touch through email and through other social media. And it's been great to stay in contact with them throughout the years and see how they've progressed and stay in touch with their families. I've even had situations where civilians who I took care of from the UN came in contact with other patients who I took care of from ABC News, from Bob Woodruff.
Oh, wow.
They made the connection together, and they realized that they both had the same surgeon, and they reached back towards me. And it was really special because the fellow we took care of, one of many from the attack on the UN, was Canadian. And I had lost touch with him, but he was in New York. And he got back in touch with me and my family and invited us back up to the UN for the memorial 10 years after the attack on the UN. And it was, basically a memorial in 2013. And that was really special because it's very easy to lose contact with, patients who are outside the military, civilian patients, those patients who went into their home countries. But it was really, quite wonderful to see. And it was a great educational process. I tell these patients, I say, yes, we did a lot to save your life, but you did a lot to actually help us advance medicine.
Yes.
So we've used a lot of those advances and we've applied it in the civilian sector. And one of the areas I focused in on was blood vessel injuries of the brain associated with blast injury and penetrating trauma. And we see that same pattern of secondary blood vessel injuries with penetrating gunshot wounds. Unfortunately, we have way too many gunshot wounds in DC. But it gives us the ability to know what to expect in terms of the secondary patterns of injury and what we can do to prevent secondary insult because of all the information that we've been able to learn from our soldiers who were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. It was such that they had body armor that made their injuries more surgical and survivable. Like in other wars, the body armor, without the body armor, they would have been, pretty much dead at the point of injury. But because of body armor, they were now able to actually benefit from surgical intervention. So the major organs, the heart, the lungs, most of the cranial vault was basically, protected, so that we were then dealing with the secondary effects of penetrating trauma through the orbit, through the face, through the forehead, or through the neck, and then the blast injury that would affect the brain and the thorax and the rest of the body. So, the body armor truly advanced survivability. And then we were able to, benefit by having, the air support and then far forward surgical teams that could resuscitate these patients. So it's a combination of things. It's not just the surgical support, because they had the same surgical support in Vietnam, but they didn't have the same kind of body armor. So having that body armor and the rapid evacuation system really made a big difference.
Yeah.
But we were seeing injuries that we hadn't seen before because of this sort of higher survivability with the body armor. And blast injury was a big part of that. And their ICU course was a big part of this. It wasn't just an isolated injury to the head. As Greg was saying, they had significant pulmonary injuries. And these injuries might be infectious. They might be barrow trauma to the lungs and, secondary infections in the extremities that then affect inflammation throughout the body that can then affect the rest of the body.
Yeah.
So they're young guys and young ladies, but they were really, really sick. And the illness wasn't just necessarily while they were in theater. It was sort of one of these situations where you follow the curve of the illness, they actually didn't reach their peak of, maximal inflammation and maximal problems with their critical illness until almost a week to 2 weeks afterwards.
For sure.
And then you're really fighting to keep them alive.
Yeah. Hey, Greg, let me pass the same sort of question to you. You received them at Walter Reed and were able to treat them with the team of teams that you had there. And then several years later, what connections have you had with those who you served?
Yeah, I would say for my specialty in critical care medicine, we don't have the same kind of relationships with patients. They tend to pass through us, and they usually don't remember their time with us because they are so critically ill. It's when they can, move back out onto the med-surg units and, wake up enough to be able to develop the relationship with the surgeon like Rocco, who saved them. It can have that longer term relationship. Most of I compare critical care medicine sometimes to being like an anesthesiologist. Your patients are asleep most of the time while you're caring for them. So you tend not to develop that relationship with the patients and families because it's very transient. And then they move on to the longer part. So no, I have not had any long-term follow-up with any of the patients.
Yeah. So just a shout out to Kevin Batul, your classmate who connected us, and
yes,
probably Scotty Miller, who's one of our dear friends also. But great class of 83, great class of 87 at West Point, and a great class of 1979 at the Citadel as well in East Kentucky for Bill Butler here. But so what have you seen as you've transitioned now? What if you were going to create a triangle of, remembering the military and military medicine, working at MedStar, friends like Rich Stone over at formerly at the VA and VA medicine. What do you see as the state of those kind of affairs? Greg, I'll start with you.
Well, when there have been some challenges in the VA in the past several years, we have been reached out to find out what our level of interest would be. And I will say that MedStar is a very military-friendly organization. Rocco and I are not the only two ex-Walter Reeders who are at the hospital center. The old Walter Reed was the Army's equivalent of what the hospital center is, a large inner city hospital that takes care of everything that comes our way. So I have been able to successfully recruit a number of people down here from Walter Reed. And we actually have, the Washington VA is across the street from us. The director of the VA over there is a former director of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. I know him well. And we are always looking for opportunities to collaborate with our colleagues in the VA. As Rocco mentioned, we have a very strong relationship with Walter Reed. And we also have a strong relationship with the Uniformed Services University. We have medical students, residents, and fellows down here all the time. You know, pre 9/11, MedStar, which is our trauma unit here, was manned by 3 teams. There was the MedStar team, there was the Army team, and there was the Navy team. So this goes way back in the relationship between the military and MedStar. So again, we are always looking for opportunities to collaborate with them and make sure that the doctors who are currently in the DoD facility up at Walter Reed have the necessary experiences so that when the balloon does go up and they've got to be called on to provide the kind of care that Rocco did, they're ready. Unfortunately, as Rocco said, because of the the knife and gun activity in the district and motor vehicle accidents and burns, et cetera, we provide that experience for them so that they can be ready whenever they're needed.
Very, very nice. Rocco, and anything that you would add as well in terms of the partnering with the VA or Walter Reed or your experiences after the military?
Yeah, I would reiterate the same things that Greg mentioned, that, the problem is that when you're in a military hospital, most of the time, and it's a peacetime referral basis, you just don't see the kind of trauma that you see, at an inner city hospital.
Yeah.
So we try to create a structure here where during the rotations, they maximize their benefit to see how to manage very unstable patients with very serious illnesses and very serious injuries. They don't necessarily compare to the exact kind of environment that you're going to find yourself in an austere, a desert or in a jungle or in a mountain terrain environment. But you basically create a framework whereby they can extend, the same kind of lessons that they've been taught to the real world application. And you teach them how to get very good at resuscitative care, what we call damage control surgery. So this idea of damage control surgery really evolved out of experiences in Vietnam and then matured quite a bit during the, combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the idea that you want to minimize the amount of time in the operating room. You want to decompress the brain or decompress the belly. You want to stop the bleeding, and you want to resuscitate the patient. So your operations can't take forever. They have to be very, very quick operations that are basically targeted to stop bleeding, to resuscitate and prevent secondary injury. And so we emphasize that quite a bit with our, rotating military staff, those from Reed and those coming from the Uniformed Services, the medical students. And then in terms of collaboration, with the VA, we continue to collaborate with the VA, especially outside of the area of just trauma, but also in the area of stroke. That's another hat that I wear. And that's a large population of patients who are at risk for stroke. And so, we're very closely tied for the VA's population of patients who might have an acute onset stroke, and the role for, neuro rescue with thrombectomy care, where we're able to navigate a catheter, which is the other part of what I do, up into the brain and remove the clot to resuscitate a stroke. And then we keep also, close ties with the rehabilitation side of medicine, through NRH and our therapists at NRH. In fact, one of the directors at NRH, Heechin Che, was actually a fellow who I knew from a military family who was getting care in Boston at Spalding Rehab. And he was one of the directors at Spalding Rehab. And then he came back down here and he worked for the military at Fort Detrick for a while, and then at Fort Belvoir, rather. And then from Fort Belvoir, he actually joined our team here at NRH. So there's a lot of cross collaboration between, military and civilian in the VA in terms of, acute resuscitative care, ICU care, rehabilitative care, and the dimensions of training. I think, one thing that the military does very, very well is it gives you a framework of how to train people. And, I think what, we learned is to sort of take that model and apply it here. I'm going to tell a little story here. Back in 1987, I was actually a medical student for Greg. Greg was the chief resident in medicine, and his attending at the time was Dr. Leonard Wartofsky. And Dr. Wartofsky was like one of the absolute national leaders for endocrinology. And then he came over here to Hospital Center, and then Greg came over here. So, this lineage of people who basically trained together and worked together. And we would go from bed to bed on rounds, and we would present the patient. But we were given a very clear framework, how to be clear, concise, to the point, and direct about what the patient's medical issues were and what the plan of care was. And I was so impressed with Greg and with Dr. Wartofsky. I said, boy, these guys are really squared away. Like, they know the details about these patients. So we have to make sure we know the details as medical students, aspiring to make sure we match their expectations. So I think that's a wonderful thing that the military does. It gives you that framework of, training and what the expectations are. And it's leadership by example.
It sure is. Let me ask you to shift just a little bit. And Rocco, I'll start with you. What was it about the enlisted medical soldiers that you worked with, both in the desert and in the hospital back here? If you were talking to our audience who were medics or nurses, what astounded you about what they did and how they did it and how good they were?
Just incredibly professional, incredibly dedicated. They would go the extra mile. It's a different environment in opposed to somebody who's watching a clock or who's clocking in and mentally checking out. They are always looking at things to say, how can we do better? How can we be more efficient? What tools do you need to be better? What tools can I help with you? And they're very savvy as to how the logistics system worked to make it work better. And they were really eager for training. They really wanted to know more about the details of the operation. They wanted to know more the details about the physiology. They were always looking to improve. And they were quite brilliant when it came down to improvising, techniques and devices. I'll never forget, we had this one patient who had a pretty significant neck fracture. And we were out in the middle of the desert, and we had to come up with what's called a traction bail system to put the neck in traction. And one of the soldiers, one of the medics, he looked at this clamp-on tray that we had from the Air Force that would clamp onto a shelf system onto our stretcher. It's called a SMED. I don't know if you know a SMED, but it had the ability to clamp on to the stretcher, so we could use the SMED to then put a bar across, to then we put the patient in tongs, pins in the head with a little bar. And with the SMED, we were able to jerry-rig a bail system with a rope and bottles of sand. We actually filled the bottles up with sand to create a traction system. So it was incredibly ingenious that this soldier came up with. And it worked quite well. We didn't have weights. You're in the middle of the desert, but you got plenty of sand. You got some water bottles. And so we were able to rig this together. And
I love it.
And I think that kind of ingenuity, that kind of ability of saying, let me see what I can do to fix this, or what can I do to make this better, coming from the medics. A lot of people don't realize this, but the whole specialty of a physician assistant really evolved out of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of PAs really came from the evolution of combat medics in Vietnam.
Cool.
And for us right now in the civilian sector here at Hospital Center, our group of almost 20 neurosurgery PAs is absolutely essential for us to run our operations. So
yeah, and Greg, same to you. As you worked in military medicine, tell us great stories about the enlisted as well, because often we can be officer-centric in our description of our experiences, but we know that we could do nothing were we not carried on the shoulders of soldiers. And and other military members in our career.
Well, there's no question about that. And I learned early on the importance of ensuring that I spent as much time as possible with our enlisted staff and our nurses. They spend more time with the patients than the physicians do. And it's absolutely critical to solicit their input, listen to their input,
yeah,
and make sure that is included into whatever the plan of care is you're going to embark on for that particular patient. When I would conduct rounds at the ICU, we'd work our way through to the point where everyone who was involved in the care of that patient, we moved around like a little beehive. Everyone who was involved with the care of that patient was expected to bring their perspective on what was going on. So it was from the nurse, it was from the respiratory therapist, it was from the pharmacist, it was from everyone who was involved in that care, because if you don't get that perspective, you're going to potentially miss something that's going to cause a less than optimal outcome for those patients. So I learned early on in my career, and actually, we were taught that at West Point. You only go as far as your senior enlisted staff, and Rocco mentioned it in his comments about what he learned on his deployment, and that is you got to check your ego at the door, and they will make or break you. And if they see humility and they see someone who really cares about them, cares about their professional development, you're going to have a great relationship because they are valued members of the team.
For sure. And we always say ego is no amigo. And likewise, we know that no matter how good we are, they don't care what we know until they know that we care. And so that's the essence of small unit leadership. So here we are at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, everybody, and just an amazing show today with two combat surgeons, Army surgeons who saved many lives and set many things on track despite very difficult and challenging situations. So as we wrap up and you look back on your service and you look forward to your continued service to people and mankind, what are your closing thoughts on all that it's meant to you to have been able to serve in this way, and where does that take you next? And Greg, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say that I've had no greater experience and have never been more proud to have cared for America's warriors. And to have been able to do that for the first half of my life is my greatest accomplishment. And I'm not sure, even having moved on this behemoth institution that I am leading, that it rates the same as that. These are America's heroes. These are people, in a country where there is no draft, who are doing this on their own. Mm-hmm. And to see their commitment and what they put on the line in going to battle, not once, not twice, but multiple times during this conflict, and the injuries that they have suffered, and the supportive families that are part of their healing and part of their life. There's no greater honor than to have been in that position to be able to provide that care.
Well, that's great. And Rocco, same question to you. Your thoughts and feelings on a life of great service, and you're just getting going. So what will be next also?
Yeah, it's been an incredible opportunity. I mean, I think it adds a whole nother level of education and appreciation for the commitment to service that these soldiers and their families have. And I really emphasize the family because, as you saw, with multiple deployments back home, there's, parents, there's spouses, there's children, and that's an enormous weight on the families, especially with deploying and redeploying. And I think one of my daughters said it best when I came home, bringing a casualty home once, and I had to go back. And she said, Dad, don't come home until you can stay home. She was 4 years old at the time. You hear that from the mouths of children, and you realize imagine the stress of somebody who gets deployed and redeployed back and forth, multiple times. One of my fondest patients was deployed 8 times, and on his 9th time, he suffered an incredibly severe traumatic brain injury. And I can only imagine what his family was going through in that experience with him being deployed so many times. And he's done remarkably well with the support of an incredible family and network. But it really humbles you to just see the sacrifice that these individuals are making and their families are making. One of the organizations that I've tried to be a part of with goes back and it looks at these organizations for veterans' families. And really it concentrates on not just the veteran, but on the children of veterans, because you look at the legacy of the service, and a lot of times these service members are missing big portions of their children's upbringing.
Yeah.
And the children are there, carrying on in terms of doing the best that they can with a parent who's not necessarily there, or a parent who doesn't come back with the same capabilities. And they're involved in a lifelong, relationship caring for that parent, or parents caring for their children, older parents caring for, their adult children who have significant disabilities as a result of these injuries. So it really puts things in perspective. And I think it's really the essence of what medicine should really be about. Essence of medicine should be about, it's not a business, it's not for profit, it's not for prestige, it's about service to people who are in the worst crisis of need. And I think the problem is that sometimes in the big picture of medicine, people lose that perspective. And it's great to see, the younger military physicians come along and they keep that same focus and that same attention. And younger service members, with that same desire to serve. It's the best that our country has, and it really should be honored, respected, and supported in every way possible. So
yeah, I think leaders that really get it, what your words apply to any MOS, because any MOS, when you start to achieve success, then it's real easy to start making life about you, being the commander, or you being very skilled and accomplished doctor, or anything else. And we always have to remind ourselves that we only can be leaders because there are those to lead, and that's the mission. And the rank has its privilege means you're privileged to serve even more people, not that you're privileged individually. Well, we're about to wrap up. I'd just like to pass to you one more time. Any closing thoughts, Rocco, that you have? I want to thank you for all that you've done, and you're being with us today, and Greg, you too. But Rocco, go ahead with a close, and then Greg, and then we'll turn over to Bill Butler.
I think it's very important to sort of, inform the rest of the country about the service of veterans and about what, has been done on foreign fields, because it's an education in terms of understanding what service is all about. That, they're not doing it for the money. They're not doing it for medals. They're not doing it for recognition. Many of the members on my team were never recognized for all that they did. And, time away from their family, time at risk on multiple deployments. And I think it's really important to educate our children and further generations as the sacrifices that are made. And I think that basically connects us all. When you look at the people who were deployed and the people who I was with, we came from all kinds of different ethnicities, all kinds of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we were all in the dirt together, and we were basically all connected with the same mission. To see that connectedness, it really defines who we are as a country, especially at this most divisive time.
Yeah.
We have a connectedness based on, the people who have gone forth to serve. And I think if any time is important to do that, this is the time where people have to come together and say, listen, we've done hard things before. we've done difficult things in the past. And we've done this by basically being unified. And, you know, the military has demonstrated that. So I really give kudos to you and what you've done with the memorial and museum to bring this to people's attention, because it's important to show that we have more things in common than we have different.
Well said, Doctor. Very well said. Really great to meet you online. I look forward to your visit here as soon as you can come, and much more to do together. And Greg, any final thoughts?
No, I would just say that, Rocco and I are examples of, the commitment that this country has made to military education and military medical education. As we continue to move away from the war, there's the usual look at institutions like the Uniformed Services University. Do we still need it? Do we still need military graduate medical education in places like Walter Reed and in San Antonio? And we do. We've talked about the commitment that we all have, the singularity of mission, and it can be very difficult for those that aren't raised and understand not just the medicine, but military medicine. And that's something that we should not forget. All the benefits that we have learned from military conflict over the last 2 centuries, we need to remind ourselves that appropriate military education is absolutely necessary for us to have the greatest possible professional cadre of physicians, whatever the group is, to be able to provide care to those heroes that are putting their lives at risk every day.
Very nicely said, Doctor. Thank you so much. Well, thank you both. And thank everyone. I'd like to thank everyone that's listening in and watching this. And you can go to our website at nationalbmm.org and see more and learn more, because we are awesome. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Colonel Retired Bill Butler, the Chief of Staff of this great team.
All right. Thanks, sir. Greg and Rocco, thanks for what you do and what you continue to do. Having witnessed some of the before and after effects and the care provided to our wounded, it's incredible, particularly when you consider the long road that many of them have, and then the accomplishments that they do on their recovery. So thanks for helping our wounded and caring for them. We also appreciate everybody's generosity in supporting veterans and the programs that help them. If you enjoyed this rally point, consider becoming a member of the National Veterans Memorial and Museum, or donating, both of which help us provide programs like Rally Point, Veteran Voices, Beyond the Exhibit, and others. We recently opened a new special exhibit. It's called 20 Years, Remembering the One, Remembering Them All. It's an exhibit created by a Dutch teenager, Dan Bonderstein, and it's a replica of the World Trade Center Plaza, and it's here until September 1st. It travels to Shanksville, PA, then the Pentagon, and then New York City to be set up at Ground Zero in the 9/11 Memorial and Museum on September 11th. And then for any soccer fans out there, tonight is military night at the Cruise game against Atlanta United. So receive a 30% discount on any tickets tonight at lower.com field. And then just as a friendly reminder, our nation is critically short of blood. Come to the museum on the 23rd of August. Donate at our monthly Red Cross blood drive. Come save a life and help somebody else. And then we would also like to give a special thank you to Lane Aviation. Their support as a corporate member helps make programs like Rally Point and some of our others possible. So everybody, thank you for joining us. Thanks for participating. Have a safe weekend, and we will cut to our last closing video. Thanks.
Wars aren't fought by countries. They're fought by people. Now, hear their stories in their own words. Honor their service in your own way. At the only museum in America that gives a voice to all our veterans. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It's more than a museum. It's the new home of the brave.